So, let's start the program. Distinguished guests, dear speakers, partners, colleagues, we are very pleased to see you all here. My name is Magnus Tannefelt. I'm director of SSEESS, the Swedish Secretariat for Environmental Earth System Sciences, based here at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. SSEESS is a partnership dedicated to promoting links between Swedish and global and sustainability research. And to this end, we team up with global partners and with partners in Sweden. And we work very closely together with a number of organizations, such as the ISSC, which we will hear more about later, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which has a regional office for Northern Europe in Gothenburg, Sweden, and with Future Earth, which has a global office in this very building. And Future Earth is a global umbrella for taking forward research to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, including, of course, inequality, while the Sustainable Development Solutions Network focuses more on practical solutions in the private and public sector. We also work closely with the core projects, 5 of which have their main headquarters in Sweden, and they are research networks strongly linked with or within the umbrella of Future Earth. So, on behalf of SSEESS and our partners, we have the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, we have Sida, and we have 3 Swedish research councils, Forte, Formas, and Vetenskapsrådet. So on behalf of all of these, we are very honored to host this event, and we welcome you to the official launch of the 2016 World Social Science Report. As you all know, mankind is today facing huge challenges stemming from the way we interact with the planet and with each other. Science has been the fundamental driver in the work of unveiling and explaining the rapid changes that we have ahead of us. We must now again turn to research for analysis of how to resist, to mitigate, and to adapt to these changes. And here the social sciences and the humanities are crucial. We must create new knowledge and utilize what we already know. We must promote our understanding of the world in a more holistic and transdisciplinary approach. And one of the most important factors for how successful we can be in dealing with future uncertainties is equality. Equality in access to resources and equality in possibilities. And this, as you know, is the focus of the report that will be presented here today. And you will hear much more about the content of this report soon. But before I give the word to the next speaker, I will say a few words of housekeeping. We will be filming, we are already filming and broadcasting live on the web. Those films will later be downloadable from the web pages. And if you do not want to appear in the filming of photos, let us know. You can access the webcast and download all the documents from the web pages of ISSC and of SSEESS, and you have the links there. And the plan today is that we will have talks about the report until 11:45, and that will be followed by lunch just outside this building for those who have signed up. And if you haven't, let us know and we will help you out, so you get something to eat. And you have a fantastic chance to mingle and discuss with the authors of the report, with the representatives of ISSC, with funding agencies who are here today, with representatives from ministries, and a lot of very interesting researchers. So do use that lunch to talk to interesting people. If we have anyone interested in media interviews with the speakers, or if you have any other questions, please let us know. Me or the staff, we have Kim right there in the corner, and we will help you out. So, without further ado, here are the speakers of today. I will soon leave the word to Göran Hansson from the Academy, and then we will have Mathieu Denis from the ISSC. He is the executive director of the organization. Then we will turn to Dendev Badarch from UNESCO, who will say a few words about their involvement in the making of this report. Charlotte Petri Gornitzka, the Director General of Sida, is unfortunately stuck in traffic at the moment. Oh! You just, sorry. Fantastic. So you're here. And then we have the authors, some of the authors of this report. I think there were more than 100 authors. But we have 3 of them here today. So we have Melissa Leach, who is the director of the Institute for Developmental Studies and co-director of the report. She will talk about challenging inequalities. We have Bo Rothstein, who is a report author. He will talk about inequality and corruption. And then we have Naila Kabeer, who will talk about the challenge of intersecting inequalities for action and for research. And then we will have a questions and answers session moderated by Mathieu, with all the speakers, the report authors, up on the stage. So, first of all, I am very happy to give the floor now to the Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Professor Göran Hansson. Please.
Thank you, Magnus. Dear friends, partners, and colleagues, a warm welcome to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. We are truly delighted that you have chosen to launch the World Social Science Report here at the Academy. Many people know about the Academy of Sciences because we award the Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics, and now also the Bank of Sweden Economics Prize. But we do much more than that. We evaluate and award science and scientists. We advise the government on scientific issues. We participate in the public debate with scientific expertise. We try to promote interest in science among young people, and we are a meeting place for scientists. And we are proud to represent science, because science is arguably the most important transformative agent for mankind. Science not only makes it possible for us to understand the world we live in, but to change it for the better. Without science, life would be so much poorer, so much harder, so much worse for all of us. The changes brought about in the last 200 years are truly remarkable. Now we are facing new problems, as mankind will always. We are facing problems of pollution and global warming, health and disease, social inequality. Without the scientific approach, and without mobilizing all our knowledge and the best of our brains, we cannot handle these formidable challenges. We at the Academy would like to help with a membership that encompasses the whole breadth of science, from mathematics and physics to chemistry, the life sciences, and all the way to the social sciences and the humanities. And we believe that we need a cross-disciplinary approach to handle successfully the challenges of today. Today, we are going to hear about the report from the International Social Science Council, which plays a very important role in addressing global problems facing mankind. And I'm sure that today's report will be not only a description of the current state, but also help identifying pathways to a just world. So with that, again, a warm welcome to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and I think we're all looking forward to an exciting report and an interesting hour ahead of us. Most welcome.
Thank you very much, Göran. And with this, I now am very pleased to introduce Mathieu Denis, the Executive Director of the International Social Science Council. Please, Mathieu.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Magnus. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, it's a tremendous pleasure for me to be here and launch the 2016 World Social Science Report, Challenging Inequalities, Pathways to a Just World. I would want to start by thanking SSEESS and its director Magnus, as well as the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for hosting the event. It is a pleasure to launch this report here in Stockholm, and I would also like to use the opportunity to thank the colleagues from Sida and its director Charlotte Petri Gornitzka. As you all know, thank you so much, Magnus. Here are copies of the reports. As you all know, Sida has been a strong supporter of the ISSC over the years, and I would like the colleagues at Sida to also regard the fact that we're launching this report here as a mark of our gratitude for the unfailing support over the past years. Colleagues, the new edition of the World Social Science Report is on inequalities. It counts over 70 contributions from over 100 authors from 40 countries. It was prepared, as was already said, by the International Social Science Council in very close collaboration with the Institute for Development Studies based at Sussex, IDS based at Sussex University. And as with the previous editions of the report, this one was co-published with UNESCO, and I would want to use again the opportunity here to also thank UNESCO for their partnership over the years around the report. The report is published in English. Translations into French, Spanish, and potentially other languages are on their way, but summaries are available as of today in English, French, and Spanish. Now, this report is the third edition, each prepared by the ISSC, and each report, although they focus on a different topic, share some strong similarities, strong same goals. So they all address a specific grand challenge, societal challenge. So this one is on inequalities. The 2010 World Social Science Report reviewed the state and evolution of social science knowledge production and use in different parts of the world. The 2013 report was on changing global environments. Each report also takes stock of social science production on a specific topic in all regions of the world, and they all make recommendations for future research priorities and for priorities for action and for policy. The topic of this edition, inequalities, obviously is very, very timely. The interest on research on inequality is huge at the moment, as can be exemplified or showed by the fact that we've seen in the past years important social dynamics, social movements that found their origins in deepening inequalities. Just think about, the Arab Spring, food riots in Latin America, recent movements in Africa, racial tensions in North America, etc. We can also see the fact, the deep interest in research on inequalities, and the fact that we've had an unusual high number of bestsellers, books, and reports discussing inequalities that have generated important debates within academia, but also, as we know, outside of academia. So there's a sense of urgency around inequalities, and in fact, the report confirms, if you want, that if unchecked, inequalities at the moment are indeed jeopardizing the sustainability of our communities, of our economies, and of our societies. The reduction of inequality is also high on the global agenda, and perhaps specifically or more clearly with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, as you probably know, the Sustainable Development Goals and the pledge that comes with them of leaving no one behind. Now, as you probably know, there is one specific goal targeting inequality goal 10. But beyond that specific goal, the report shows that unless we address inequality urgently, this ambition to leave no one behind will be an empty slogan. So in that context, what can and what must a world report on inequalities achieve and do? Well, we thought that it has to look beyond economic inequality and look into the many intersecting dimensions of inequality. Now, the report identifies 7 such dimensions: economic, political, social, cultural, environmental, spatial, and knowledge-based, and looks systematically into their interactions. Instead of focusing on, say, 1 or 2, looks into their interactions. The report documents trends in inequalities in all regions of the world, including in countries that are well less researched. It analyzes consequences of inequalities and develops possible future scenarios. It identifies strategies to reduce inequalities. It provides a multidisciplinary contribution on the topic that represent, if you want, the full scope of social science knowledge and work on inequalities. And it identifies critical knowledge gaps and priorities for future research, and proposes a global research agenda on inequality. Now, the report was produced over a period of more or less 2 years. Be happy to answer questions on the production process if you have some. But I will let the other speakers focus more precisely on key messages and specific aspects that are developed in the report. But I would want to finish by thanking explicitly the institutions that have generously supported the development and production of the 2016 World Social Science Report. That's again, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, UNESCO, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, European Science Foundation, Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, the Research Council of Norway, the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, and the Swedish Research Council. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathieu. So, we now are very pleased to welcome Mr. Dendev Badarch from UNESCO up on the floor here. You are Director of the Division of Social Transformations and Intercultural Dialogue, Social and Human Sciences sector at UNESCO. So, you have a presentation right there. There you go. Welcome.
Thank you very much. The Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Director General of Sida, members of the Academy, the authors and the editors of the report, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, on behalf of UNESCO, allow me to express my deepest gratitude to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for hosting the launch of 2016 World Social Science Report entitled Challenging Inequalities, Pathways to a Just World. It is a great pleasure and privilege to launch the report today with its double-pronged focus on the power of social sciences and the role of knowledge they produce in shaping inclusive societies. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to briefly outline UNESCO's mandate in social sciences, our long-standing commitment to the World Social Science Report, and the values of 2016 report to science and policy communities. UNESCO is a guardian and advocate of and for robust sciences and their impact on our societies. Linking knowledge to policy and action is amongst our core priorities. UNESCO's Intergovernmental Management of Social Transformations program is specifically tasked with mobilizing social science for inclusive and sustainable social change, and with bringing together experts, policymakers, to develop shared, scientifically informed, and politically relevant agendas. Improving the knowledge policy action nexus in such a manner is imperative. It is, however, neither a short-term nor linear exercise, even more so in the case of social and human sciences. In many countries of the world, these result in suboptimal translation of the knowledge into practice and weak interface between social and human sciences on the one hand, and the policy and action communities on the other hand. In such a context, aggregating the voices of the social sciences on priority issues in a multidisciplinary way, taking stock of existing research and loopholes, and advising on future research agendas becoming critical. This is exactly what the World Social Science Report so aptly do. UNESCO's long-standing commitment, its role as a permanent co-publisher and co-founder of the World Social Science Reports, stem from its mandate and the deep belief I have sketched a moment ago. These seminal reports are cornerstone of our lasting cooperation with the International Social Science Council, for which we are deeply grateful. Throughout the year, the World Social Science Reports serve as a source of solid social science knowledge and evidence-based messages, which UNESCO co-shapes and takes to audiences across the world. These are delivered loudly and clearly to scientists, policymakers, and practitioners. This has been the case with all World Social Science Reports, which mentioned my colleague Mathieu. The 2016 seminal report on inequalities is set to follow the same path. We wish to take this opportunity to thank the Council for its intellectual and editorial efforts to produce another successful report in collaboration with the Institute of Development Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, in reference to the 2016 report we are launching today, brings me to its theme, inequalities, and its utmost importance at all levels and contexts. The world is converging around high-level inequalities. Demands for greater equity and inclusion are strong and have been on the rise for some time now. Stemming from movements at national level in both global north and south, they culminated in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. With the adoption of this agenda, with its Sustainable Development Goals 10 and 16, specifically dedicated to inclusive societies and the reduction of inequalities between and within countries, the international community is firmly committed to meeting this challenge. This agenda is premised on such a change. Inequality is not a singular notion. On the contrary, inequalities are multidimensional, multi-layered, and cumulative. The report makes clear that addressing effectively inequalities requires going beyond wealth and income disparities to counter the political, environmental, social, cultural, spatial, and knowledge accesses. Policies and solutions will not be feasible and sustainable unless they are as multi-pronged as the inequalities. And this requires robust social science research. Furthermore, the matter of knowledge goes to the heart of transparent and wise change management. It is robust evidence and research that can and should inform policies, underpin decisions, and enable management of shift towards more equitable and inclusive societies. I would like to quote the Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, on this report. Investment in knowledge is down payment for informed change under the Sustainable Development Goals. End of quote. Social science research agenda equally requires revisiting. The call so clearly made in this report is for step change towards research agenda that is interdisciplinary, multi-scale, globally inclusive, and conducive to transformative knowledge. Inequalities are undoubtedly a major concern for social science today. A five-fold increase in the studies of inequality and social justice in academic publications from 1990 to 2013 is clearly demonstrated of this fact. However, this report reveals two major knowledge divides in research into inequality that remains to be bridged. The first divide refers to the focus, which is too narrow in too many studies. As the report shows, there is too little attention at the moment to the overlapping inequalities that go beyond income and wealth to reach health, knowledge, or gender. The second divide concerns the concentration of social science research into inequalities in the global north, where reliable knowledge base already exists and where over 80% of publications on inequalities originate. This happens to the detriment of the countries of the South without similarly robust data. To overcome these knowledge divides, we need more cooperation across disciplines, across borders, and across inequality specializations to help governments develop more effective and inclusive policies. International networks, open data sources, co-creation of knowledge, open access to publishing and software are vital to achieving this. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to say at the time when the world is seeking to realize its new vision for an inclusive and sustainable future, this World Social Science Report must be required reading for scientists, policymakers, activists, and all concerned citizens. This report is clear in its message on inequalities and its overall call related to knowledge. Leaving no one behind is a cross-cutting ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals. To achieve this ambition tomorrow, it is vital to invest in and close the social science knowledge gap into inequalities today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I am now very happy that we are able to welcome the Director General of Sida, Charlotte Petri Gornitzka, who defied traffic to get here. Welcome.
Thank you very much. There was an accident, but it wasn't a bad accident, so we're all happy about it. Professor Göran Hansson, Dr. Dendev Badarch, Dr. Mathieu Denis, Professor Melissa Leach, Dr. Magnus Tennerfeldt, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As is well recognized today, and the World Social Science Report before us confirms this, humanity is now shaping the Earth system. We live in a new geological time dominated by humankind. This academy has historically been the cradle and coordination node of much state-of-the-art science, from Svante Arrhenius to Bert Bolin. The academy has increasingly moved in the direction of becoming a universal, integrated, inter- and transdisciplinary source of knowledge and social practice. Without this new science policy compact, the recent climate change agreement and the new global goals would hardly have come into being, at least with the quality. Moreover, without the Science Policy Compact, the goals and targets the international community have set for itself would not be implementable. And against this background, the World Science Report that is launched today is a step further along the necessary dialogue between science and policymakers. Sida has stood firmly behind past and present World Social Science reports for this reason. We believe that science for sustainability and well-being can only be achieved through the research supporting informed decision-making, and this is not happening enough. Could be happening more. It is rare to see a world report that is so multidisciplinary in its approach and broad in terms of geographical coverage and authorship. It includes scientists from both developing and developed countries. Global initiatives as these will help identify practical solutions to some of the key developmental challenges required at international and regional levels. As pointed out in one of the key messages of the report, and I quote, "A step change towards a research agenda that is interdisciplinary, multi-scale, and globally inclusive is needed to inform pathways toward greater equality." At Sida, within our mission to reduce poverty in the world, we are committed to see people first, to work towards enabling individuals to get a better life and to help them help themselves in identifying pathways towards a better future. Building long-term capacity, individual and organizational, at global and regional levels, and particularly among those most in need. This is a golden rule of Sida's research cooperation. Science is an essential and effective step towards sustainable development and poverty reduction. While many national funders primarily sponsor projects led by their own national institutions, and perhaps in silos, we try to have a broader scope at Sida. With the universality of the Agenda 2030 and the principle of leaving no one behind, we need increased knowledge, visibility and impact at all levels, global, regional and local, and we need to work together. Swedish priorities for development cooperation include environment and climate, gender equality, democracy and human rights. All of them have strong bearing and relevance to the topic of challenging inequalities, which inspire the World Social Science Report we are celebrating here today. An example of our commitment to these issues is the ongoing Transformations to Sustainability program, where Sida is a major sponsor. This is a leading initiative of the International Social Science Council to help advance transformations to more sustainable and equitable societies around the globe. It is ultimately the new knowledge emerging from global scientific projects such as these that makes the World Social Science Report series possible. The statement in the preamble to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we pledge that no one will be left behind. That's the preamble. It is a powerful reminder that all life is one, and that material progress comes with ethical responsibilities. Seeing that all living creatures, including their life-supporting environment, are treated with dignity. Undeniable scientific progress has reached a particular critical phase when we need to focus more on why we make choices, not only on how to be faster, how to be smarter, and how to be better. A new role for the humanities, so often forgotten, is crucial in this regard. What the World Science Report ultimately reminds us about is interdependence. We are all in this together. We, Sida, will take home the seminal messages of this timely report, and we will further discuss its outcome, not only today, but especially this afternoon during a dedicated session at Sida. But I can assure you that ongoing work on new knowledge, not only creating new knowledge, but to really learn and use knowledge, is core of what Sida is trying to do. And if I may be a bit personal, I am leaving this role as Director General in 2 weeks' time to become the chair of OECD DAC, which is all the donors. So that's even more. There are even more opportunities in that role. But I must say that development without exploring and using and informing policies based on research is, I wouldn't say not worth doing, but is so essential to the role that we play. So I'm very grateful to be here today, so that this meeting is part of my last 2 weeks at Sida. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we're especially honored that you spend these last weeks, part of it with us. Right, so now it's time to hear from the people who actually wrote the report. It's a beautiful report. I wish we could have it there so you can see it. And first out is Melissa Leach, who is the co-director of the report, and you are also the director of the International Development Studies Institute, the Institute of Development Studies. Yes, sorry. There you go. Okay. I'll do that. Yeah, sorry. Good.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Again, esteemed guests, ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, friends. It's an enormous pleasure to be here today launching this report. It's been a long, intense project over the last couple of years, but it's also been an enormous pleasure and privilege to work with the ISSC, with UNESCO, and with the nearly 100 authors who've contributed to this report. So here we are, and what I want to lay out for you is just a sense of some of the key messages around really the double sense of challenging inequalities that's here in this title. On the one hand, the report looks at why inequalities are so challenging. On the other hand, it looks at how we can challenge them. There's a set of positive messages there. So why are inequalities challenging? First, it's because they're rising. Bringing together the latest evidence on inequality trends, the report documents, for instance, the dramatic rise in the incomes of that top 1% of earners globally, so that we see, as the Oxfam report from earlier this year showed, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a really small elite, 62 individuals now owning the same wealth as the whole of the bottom half of the world population. The report shows that globally, global inequality, that is between the living standards of the entire global population, has actually declined during the first decade of this century. But that's been driven largely by reduced inequality between countries, and especially the large reductions in poverty in China and in India, particularly as big sections of those populations move to urban areas. What we're also seeing, though, is rising inequalities within countries, threatening to reverse this positive trend. And these rising inequalities are seen more or less everywhere. In the old industrialized countries of North America and the European heartland, we're seeing rising inequalities here simply measured by Gini coefficient in more or less all countries. In emerging economies, middle-income countries, the data are scarcer and the time series are shorter. But we're also seeing countries such as Colombia, Brazil, and India registering even higher levels of income inequality than we see in the industrialized countries of the North. South Africa today has the highest income inequality, despite a slight decrease in recent years. China is a very interesting case, not shown here, where we saw that Gini coefficient between 1985 and 2008 rise by about 11 points, although in the last couple of years we've seen a slight decline, which could begin to mark a turning point. We're also seeing inequalities rising in sub-Saharan Africa, although the data here are even poorer. Mixed picture, some variation between countries, but overall a set of trends that are really extremely worrying. But a key message of the report is that the inequalities that matter aren't just economic. They're not just inequalities of income and wealth, important as those are. To understand and respond to inequality, we also need to address these 6 further dimensions that Mathieu has already underlined: the political, the social, the cultural, the spatial, the environmental, and inequalities related to knowledge. And this is why the report often talks of multiple inequalities, not just inequality. The contributions in diverse ways show the numerous ways that these multiple inequalities interact. They do so in shaping drivers, so the contribution by Bayoumi around Egypt shows that health inequalities are the result of both inequalities of income, inequalities in access to that health system, but also political and gender inequalities. But we also see how for particular people, inequalities can intersect and compound each other. Whether we're talking of young people in Europe, farmers in Malawi, citizens or refugees in the Middle East, or urban residents in South Africa or India. We see how people often experience intersecting forms of discrimination and injustice, and that these can ratchet in a way that creates downward spirals. We see some of the most enduring forms of inequality being those that are what the report terms in broad ways cultural inequalities, those associated with identities like race, caste, ethnicity. Gender, too, pervades all of those. And in many settings, we see women and girls facing persistent and sometimes increasing material disadvantages intersecting with discriminatory social norms, violence, and deep restrictions on voice and participation. And critically, the report also looks at the importance of perceptions of inequality. It's not just the material, it's how people understand their own situations. And these downward spirals of intersecting inequalities can drive down people's sense of aspiration, their capacities to look to a different kind of way of life, something we see particularly among young people in many parts of the world. The report shows that rising inequalities matter, and they matter in many ways. Most fundamentally, they're a question of justice. Inequalities are ethically and morally objectionable. They don't have any place in societies which are striving for greater fairness and justice. And I think that's a key point to remember. But inequalities also matter in rather more instrumental ways, with far-reaching consequences for almost every aspect of our lives and for the ability of societies nationally and globally to achieve other political and social goals, including those embodied in the SDGs in Agenda 2030. The report shows and argues that actually tackling inequality, Goal 10 in Agenda 2030, needs to be regarded as a central goal because it's actually necessary for countries to achieve almost all the others. So why is that? Well, let's just look at some of these consequences and interactions. Inequalities can act as a really critical impediment on growth and particularly abilities to tackle poverty and poverty reduction. Ravi Kanber's article shows this very clearly. Inequalities also undermine our ability to respond to crises, something we saw in the Ebola crisis over the last couple of years in West Africa, as inequalities in health access, but also the effects of inequality on trust undermined the ability of outbreak control teams to work effectively with local populations. Health and nutrition, the core focus of several of the SDGs, are worse in countries with higher income inequality, while, as Naomi Hussein's article points out, we see things like the area of hunger witnessing new manifestations of inequality around nutrition, what she terms the stuffed and starved phenomenon of both chronic undernourishment and levels of rising obesity coexisting. Inequality also affects conflict and access to justice. Osby's article shows this very clearly, noting the importance of horizontal inequalities, inequalities between groups for conflict, as well as the role of sheer inequality between rich and poor nations as drivers of conflict worldwide. And critically for the SDGs, inequality is deeply linked with environmental unsustainability and therefore the ability to achieve the goals around climate change, around water, around land. Inequalities and environmental problems are produced by many of the same processes and drivers. Inequalities and the poverty they drive can worsen environmental problems, driving people into unsustainable practices and allowing the rich to get away with impunity with pollution and environmental activities. And we also see inequality hindering the forms of cooperation, whether in local institutions, in countries or globally, which are so critically needed to tackle environmental challenges. So, is this a depressing picture? Well, maybe. But what the report also reminds us is that the future of inequality is not set, it's unwritten. And it crucially depends on choices that are made by people and by decision makers at many levels. And we were very excited in this report to go beyond the analysis of inequalities, to think about what pathways towards greater equality might mean, and what businesses, governments, citizens, development agencies, and the public at large might do to bring those about. And here there are a number of key messages. The first is that the successful countries, and there are many examples of countries which have seen falls in inequality in recent years, whether we're talking about Brazil over the last decade, some of what we're seeing happening in China very recently, or indeed some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, is that they combine policies and action in very context-specific ways. One size does not fit all here. But there is still much that one can learn from these positive country experiences. Some of that is around what we call changing the rules. Changes in policies and regulation which can move us towards greater equality, whether those are in the areas of taxation, of social protection, of access to services, or regulation of the market forces which have been behind some of the big rises in economic inequality that we've seen. But these need to be combined with social and political action. And the most effective pathways we see are when one gets coherent, integrated packages of policy solutions linked with commitment by governments and citizens to making those real, to implementation. But again, this doesn't happen in the same way in every place. And what many of the contributions show is the importance of these embedded histories which have shaped past pathways and then affect what is possible into the future. Just 3 examples here, showing the importance of forms of embedded racial inequality in the US, which are actually critical to ways of tackling almost all other kinds of inequality. In African settings, the histories going back to the colonial period and before of elite control over land and important assets shape what is possible and what needs to happen for the future. While in industrialized Western countries, some of the biggest issues concern the way globalization has polarized the rich and the working classes, squeezing a middle class and creating some real challenges around employment, which again set the context that approaches to tackling inequality must now address. But a further key message from the report is that it is not only about what governments and formal decision makers can do. We also see many examples of collective action by citizens and by grassroots groups, which are important, partly in opening spaces for positive decisions to be made, important for pushing political will, as we saw, for instance, in the public participation in Brazil around its zero hunger effort, and indeed the other changes towards lesser inequality that we saw in that country over the last decade. We see the ways that citizens can form new kinds of alliance with other stakeholders. The instance of health inequalities in Egypt provides another really good example there, where doctors, citizens, patients groups, decision makers got together. But also the importance of what's happening absolutely at the grassroots. Forms of protest, but also positive action, which are beginning to challenge inequalities in many places. And indeed, different ways of organising economies and societies, often in small ways, such as the instances of women's-led savings groups that we see in different parts of the world, or small examples of solidarity economies, whether in the North or in the global South, that not only provide different ways of organising at the micro scale, but actually prefigure what a different kind of economic future might look like. But to bring much of this about, it's not just a question of action, it's also a question of how that action is linked with knowledge. So the final but critical set of messages for this report are about the role of social science, but particularly what kinds of social science we need to build transformative pathways to a fairer world. So here we need to come back to the question of inequalities, not just in the world, but inequalities in the knowledge produced about inequalities. The report includes a lot of bibliometrics in a detailed annex, and there are some stark messages here about these knowledge inequalities. They happen by discipline. So here we see that over the last couple of decades, social science publications on inequality have been really heavily dominated by economics. This is the top line here in orange. Other disciplines have played a role. My own discipline of anthropology has been remarkably quiet, but it's still economics that continues to dominate the field. We also see inequalities by region. So again, between 1992 and 2013, more than 80% of the publications produced about inequality and justice, searching by those keywords, were produced in North America and in Europe. So these sorts of inequalities in knowledge lead us to make some key points in thinking about new agendas. And these are the priorities that the report identifies. So the first one talks about, yes, we need more knowledge production about inequality, but it's that last sentence, in those places most affected, that's crucial. Trying to redress those gaps about knowledge about inequality from the most marginalized countries, the countries experiencing the greatest effects. We therefore do need better measurement, but we need comparisons, and comparisons that look across the world between different countries. We also need, priority 3, to deepen our understanding of how, especially people experiencing the sharp end of inequality, how they experience it and what we can learn from them. The report has some really powerful examples of those experiences, but it was hard to find them, and this is a real gap that I think we must address into the future. We also need, I think, to push forward on this understanding of multiple inequalities and develop ways of understanding and measuring and indicators for multidimensional inequalities, in parallel to the kinds of indicators of multidimensional poverty that we've seen in recent years. Multidimensional inequalities are still a largely untapped area and a big challenge for social science. We need to understand the local and the global and how they connect, both in the past and thinking about the future. Critically, because we need more that's about transformative pathways towards greater equality, not just understanding what's happening now. And finally, our seventh priority recognises that case studies, the bottom-up knowledge is critical, but those need to be combined. We need theory. We actually also need new syntheses, which can take social science understanding forward. So this is about the step change, as others have said. A step change that needs to go beyond measurement to understanding in a truly multidisciplinary way these intersecting and multiple forms of inequality. That go beyond quantification, which is important, but which needs to be combined with some really innovative use of the qualitative, the participatory, and other kinds of methods to see how inequalities persist and what can be done about them. And finally, an agenda that doesn't just produce more business as usual social science, but actually produces social science in a new way that is co-constructed very often with actors in society, that's transdisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary, that engages with natural scientists and with decision makers, and which takes really seriously that question of whose knowledge counts. I think if we want to challenge inequalities, the social science community, its supporters, its funders, needs urgently to mobilise around an agenda of this kind. And the degree and the levels of inequality that we're now seeing in the world and their multiple consequences mean that the time to do that really is now. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So there's a lot to think about in this report. And now we are very honored to have no less than Bo Rothstein with us, professor in government and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, and also professional fellow at the University of Oxford in the UK. And you will talk about inequalities and corruption. Please, Bo.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, esteemed scholars, I'm very proud to be here today. Also, since I'm a member of this academy, if I read the report correctly, I'm also the only Swedish contributor to the report. I should also say that although I am now at Oxford University, most of this research comes from my former place, University of Gothenburg, where I, together with my colleague Søren Holmberg, created a research program some 12 years ago that we titled the Quality of Government Institute. It's a quite large institute. It's now 25 people. I'm still affiliated with the institute. And we have been doing this type of research since 2004. And since we heard that multidisciplinary is important, I would like to say this is truly interdisciplinary. We do everything from very quantitative work to ethnographic work. Okay, why is this important? This is a map of one of the standard measures of levels of corruption in various countries. The more red, the worse. The more yellow, light yellow, the better. And this is important because, as you can see, countries with reasonably low levels of corruption is the exception, not the rule. A fair estimation would say that something about 70% of the world's population live in countries with dysfunctional, corrupt, unfair government institutions. You can see that this is basically Europe north of the Alps. North America, what would you have? North of Chicago, north of Illinois, something like that. Australia, Japan, some strange small places, Cape Verde, Botswana, Hong Kong, Singapore. That's it. So the default position is not Denmark, but a highly corrupt country. I would like to underline that although we see this huge variation, there can, of course, never be such a thing as an uncorrupt society. This is not only a problem for the developing countries or for former communist countries. Uncorrupt country would be as likely as a country without crime. But we also know that there is huge variation here. Just to give you one feel of this, two esteemed, well-known policy economist, Daniel Kaufman, former chief economist at the World Bank, and Simon Johnson, former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, explains the crash at Wall Street in 2008 in terms of corruption. This is data that we have collected. It's some 120,000 interviews with people with very detailed questions about their perceptions and experiences of various forms of institutional malpractice, not only corruption, but also incompetence or systematic discrimination in three areas: healthcare, education, and the police. And we have sampled here on regions. So we have 600 person per regions. And as you can see, there is huge variation within Europe. Not surprisingly, Greece is worst out. But as you can see, there is also stunningly huge regional variations in some countries, especially Italy. Southern and mid-Italy, you would see here, is bad, I would say, maybe not on a Nigerian, but well on a Moroccan level. But northern Italy, you see regions as clean as Denmark. Now, this sends a very important message. Tinkering with national institutions gives you very little. It's all at the local and regional and municipal level. Italy is a country that have had the same formal institutions for 150 years. It gives you nothing. Uganda, one of the world's most corrupt countries, have, according to the World Bank, almost perfect institutions against corruption. So this is one central policy measure. Why is this important? Well, this is one standard measure of well-being, the Human Development Index, many of you know. And we have, this is a simple correlation, the level of democracy. This is a measure we have constructed. It's a combination of how well the elections work and how well civil rights and political rights are respected. And here comes the bad news. It gives you very little. We just heard, and I think this is enormously sad, that 22 years after apartheid was miraculously done away with, South Africa is now the most unequal country in the world. Actually, if you look at the number of human development indexes, they are worse now than in 1994. For example, the number of women who die when they give birth. They have not succeeded in increasing the number of months the kids go to school with one single month since 1994. I would like to make one thing very clear. I'm not arguing against democracy. I'm a big fan of democracy. But what I'm saying here, and this is the clear result, democracy is not enough. If you do not get control over corruption and increase the quality of government, yes, democracy will not deliver. Moreover, democracy is not a safe cure against corruption. Some of the most corrupt countries are the newly democratized ones. So yes, let's change here to something else, a measure, government effectiveness, and bang, here you get something. Countries that have effective governments, control of corruption, rule of law, they deliver human well-being. Take another measure, happiness. Do you get more happy living in a democracy? A little, but really not that much. But, yeah, just change to control of corruption and you get something. Actually, when you do the big number regression analysis here, it's people, the reason why people are unhappy are, first, if they feel that they are not under good health. Second come that if you feel that you live under unfair, discriminatory, or corrupt institutions. Everything else fades away. Money, yes, you do get more happy with money, but only to the amount we had when I was a teenager in this country. Now we have doubled, and it doesn't, as it can be measured, give you anything. I could show you some 40 more pictures, scatter plots like this, but this is the general measure. If I today, after been doing this research for 15 years, if I today would summarize why the main causes for inequality and human misery, they have nothing to do with economics. We have all the resources we need in the world. They have nothing to do with lack of medical devices or new medicines or new treatments. According to the World Health Organization, we have everything. They have nothing to do with new technical innovations. If you would summarize human misery today, I would put all my money on saying that the most crucial factor is low quality of government and corruption. Just to give you one example, we're now doing detailed case studies, find very strong causal effect between corruption and the outbreak of civil wars, both in Afghanistan and in other such wars. Okay, what works against inequality? This is before I started corruption, I did nice research, welfare state research on social justice. This is if you can have public provision of basic resources through universal social policies. These are things like healthcare, education, public transportation, support to families. And this is based on the well-known Nobel laureate Amartya Sen's idea of basic capabilities as the most serious, I think, theory behind the question, equality of what? All inequalities are not bad. All equalities cannot be defended. Some people have more talent than others. I'm from a city where Zlatan Ibrahimovic comes from, so yeah. And I don't think it's unfair. However, one thing that is not well understood is that people think that in order to create more redistribution, you should tax the rich and give to the poor. That is not true. The systems that end up with most redistribution are the universal ones that tax everyone and give to everyone. The reason is very simple. Taxes are usually proportional, but services are nominal. And this creates a gigantic redistributive machine. That is why Denmark is much more redistributive than the UK, for example. I could show you this in simple mathematics, but I don't have the time here. But this is a very important lesson, because if the trick with this is to get people to pay taxes, and if you have selective social policies, the middle class are not included, then they will not accept high taxes. Then you will have far less to redistribute. There is one problem with universal social policies. They will only be supported electorally. I'm a political scientist, so I think, can you get sort of electoral support for things? They will only be supported if the quality of the institutions that are going to deliver these services are high enough. If you think about it, trust in institutions and social solidarity depends on a very huge leap of faith. You must trust that the state will be able to fairly connect enough taxes and fees. You may be willing to pay high taxes, but not if you're the only one in the country, like think of Greece. But you must also trust that the state will handle the money in a responsible way, and policies will not be drowned in corruption. You can say, yes, I think a universal pension system is good, but I completely distrust this government to handle the money in a responsible way. Think Hungary. Can you trust that the state will actually be able to deliver when you need your hip transplantation or whatever it is? Will deliver. And you also have very strong ideas about how it is delivered. You want it to be delivered in an acceptable way. You do not want to be treated like cattle in the services. So these are huge leaps of faith, and all of them depends on that you can trust that the institutions work. Moreover, of course, you would like the state also to be able to handle abuse and overuse. You may be in support of a generous unemployment insurance, but you do not want people who are able to work and can find work to be on the dole, right? So, if you have selective social policies, like in many countries where you sort of are going to help the poor, they often create suspicion regarding fairness in implementation, and means testing leads to negative stereotyping. This has been best formulated by an American colleague many years ago. He says, the best way to help the poor is not to talk about them, in the sense that they should be included in programs that goes to everyone. While universal social policies are based on equal treatment and thus less far bureaucratic discretion and intrusion, if you have selective social policies, the bureaucrats have to make two very complicated decisions. One is, is this person who is applying for support eligible? And if so, how much? And it turns out it's very difficult to do this keeping with legitimacy. While universal social policies are based on an idea of equal treatment and thus less bureaucratic discretion, and they produce a sense of equality of opportunity and institutional fairness. What are the empirical results from our survey and quantitative research? Well, if you've compared countries, the standard theory, not least coming out from this country, from the Institute at Stockholm University of Social Policy, Sophie, is that the best explanation for welfare state effort is politics, how much left governments you have had in countries. The more left government, the more generous the welfare state. We find this is only partly true. We find that countries with the best possible level of quality of government will spend 21% more of its GDP on welfare state services compared to a country with the lowest possible quality of government. And this is only OECD countries. So what we are saying is, yes, you can have a left government, Greece, but if people don't trust the institutions, they will not pay the taxes, not even the ones who support it. And we now have also individual level data on this. This is from the European Social Survey. The analysis is carried out by my colleague Stefan Svalfors. The results are this. A person who is in favor of more socio-economic equality, but who lives in a country where he or she perceives that there is low quality of government institutions, will in the same survey say that I am for lower taxes, less public spending. However, the same person who is in favor of more socio-economic equality, but who lives in a country where he or she perceives that the quality of the government institutions is okay, will in the same survey say, yes, I'm prepared to pay higher taxes for more social spending. So without getting the quality of government thing going, there will be far less policies that can alleviate equality. The electorate will simply say no. So, what are the take-home lessons from this? It's been well known for a long time that corruption in terms of just bribes hurts poor people more than middle class and rich people. What we are finding is that corruption also makes it much harder for any government or social movement to get broad support for universal social policies. Corruption and low quality of government is thus probably the #1 enemy for alleviating poverty and inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bo. Interesting thoughts indeed. And I hope the politicians are listening carefully to this. Yes, so now we turn to the third author of this report, and it's Naila Kabeer. Welcome up here. You're Professor of Gender and International Development at the Gender Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And the title of your talk, you have no presentation, right? Yeah. The title of your talk is The Challenge of Intersecting Inequalities for Action and for Research. So, please, Naila.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here as a representative of this very diverse and rich and comprehensive report. One thing I think I'd like to begin with is to say that while Melissa pointed out to the rise in publications and research on inequalities, let us not forget that inequalities has entered the development agenda relatively recently. That for a long time we were very much focused on poverty and on absolute poverty. And that is, of course, critical because absolute deprivation is, above all, is perhaps one of the most overriding injustices. But it tells us only a small part of the story of why absolute poverty continues. And I think to go back to the Millennium Development Goals, which was a very powerful international mobilization around someone called it the biggest promise to tackle poverty in the world, in the history of the world. All the nations of the world coordinated their efforts to tackle poverty. Inequality entered that MDG agenda in, I think, just two ways. The first was as part of goal #1, we talked about addressing the very poorest quintile, I think it was. So we acknowledged that income was distributed in unequal ways, and those at the bottom of the income distribution deserved special attention. So we saw there an example of inequality defined by income. The second way in which inequality entered the Millennium Development Goals was goal #3, gender inequality. But there was very little attention in gender inequality to the issue of poverty. When we talk about reducing primary education, inequalities in primary education, we are touching on poverty. When we talk about reducing inequalities in all levels of education, we're talking about inequality much more generally. When we're talking about putting women in parliament, the likelihood that that will actually address the very poorest is a little remote. So gender inequality is a cross-cutting inequality. It cuts across income levels, it affects the very wealthiest as well as the very poorest. And that was really all. That was all that we did on inequality in the MDGs. And I think that was perhaps a good step forward, that we tackled poverty. But one of the lessons that came out of the MDGs is that the focus on measuring progress in terms of averages and proportions tended to blur how unevenly that progress was distributed. It tended to invisibilize the fact that systematically certain groups of people, certain groups of the poor, were locked out and left behind. And I think it is recognition of that very glaring failure of the MDGs that has led to the SDGs taking the issue of inequality seriously and explicitly and marrying it, income inequality, marrying it to the principle of leave no one behind. And I think it's that principle of leave no one behind that I'd like to address my comments to. Income inequality, or what Francis Stewart calls vertical inequalities, rank people vertically by their place in the income distribution. Group inequalities, Melissa talked about the enduring nature of cultural inequalities, divide people by identity. So economists have talked about income, sociologists have talked about identity, geographers draw attention to spatial and geographical inequalities. And I'm not talking here about just the inequalities between nations as an aspect of the geography of inequality, but the geography inequality within nations, the way in which certain areas of a country, certain bits of a town, tend to be underserved, tend to be harder to reach, tend to be more challenging. Now, if we put these inequalities, for the time being, let us just focus on these three: income inequalities, group-based inequalities, and spatial inequalities, and ask about those groups of people that are at the intersection of these inequalities, we begin to see what it means to say the hardest to reach. These are the people who are deprived by income, who are culturally discriminated on the basis of their identity, and who are located in places where it requires that additional extra mile to reach them. And that is what I mean by intersecting inequalities. And why I distinguish it from the idea of group inequalities is group inequalities can cut across. We can have, if we look at anti-Semitic discrimination against Jews in the United States, not all Jewish people were poor. Many were quite wealthy, but they still faced discrimination on the basis of their religious identity. But my concern is with those people whose identity intersects with their income, with their place in the distribution, and very often with their geography. Now, how does political, the inequalities of representation fit into this? And I've thought a bit about this, and I think it has a slightly different status in defining intersecting inequalities. Because I think political representation, or inequalities in representation, is both a cause and an effect of intersecting inequalities. If you are denied voice, then you are unable to ensure that the infrastructure that you need, the services that you need, are going to come to you. But if you are denied infrastructure and services, then that trap that keeps you in your place is reinforced. So I think voice and representation are both symptom and cause of these intersecting inequalities. And gender, I think, is interesting because, as I said earlier, it cuts across. It cuts across rich and poor nations, though I think a Swedish social scientist distinguished between basic inequalities and I think he called it elite inequalities. So in Sweden, perhaps you don't have basic gender inequalities. I don't think you do. But in other parts of the world, inequalities, gender inequalities mean that women die in larger numbers, girls die in larger numbers, they are hungrier, and so on. Perhaps in Sweden, your inequalities relate to the glass ceiling and to representation in the political sphere, and so on. So gender cuts across inequalities, but by and large, gender, when it intersects with income, politics, and space, intensifies forms of inequality. So for instance, if we look a little bit at some of the data from I'll just try and remember it. From places like Brazil, Bolivia, South Africa, where data is available, we find that while race divides or predicts inequalities in incomes, in likelihood of poverty between white, mestizo, African groups, at the bottom of the wage earning or the poverty hierarchy are women from those discriminated against groups. So I think we should not lose sight of the fact that while gender cuts across all forms of inequality, it intensifies and exacerbates these inequalities at the bottom. The literature on group inequalities, on horizontal inequalities, has been very important in drawing attention to what I call the noisy consequences of inequality. And by that I mean war, conflict, and we've seen today the refugees, all of that, is in a sense these group inequalities playing out in the wider context. But there are other more silent consequences that we do not always pick up, or we do not always recognize them as symptoms of inequality. We see them as part of the problems of these marginalized groups or these other kinds of people. And that includes things like depression, lack of self-confidence, alcoholism. You know, in India, the data on alcoholism and domestic violence is much higher amongst the so-called untouchable caste and tribal groups than they are in the rest of the population. It is blamed in India by the attributes of these people, of these castes and these tribes. But I think we can see them in a way relating to what the earlier speaker talked about, is the despair that comes out of knowing that no matter how hard you work and no matter how much effort you put in, nothing is going to change. And I think that, to me, is what is the glaring tragedy of inequality. Yes, there are good inequalities. They reflect differences in talent, differences in hard work. But there are inherited, unjustified inequalities, and those are the stuff of tragedy. I think one of the most powerful studies that I use a lot in this kind of research is a study, again, an experiment done in a South Indian school, where children in a school were asked to solve a maze puzzle. And you had children from different castes. And as long as the children's names were not called out, thereby revealing what their castes were, children from the Dalit, the untouchable castes, performed as well as children from the better-off castes. Then they called out their names, and they asked them to do another puzzle. And then the children from the Dalit castes performed worse than the children from the better-off castes. And then they segregated the children into their caste groups. And the performance of the Dalit children plummeted. And I don't buy these experiments that often, but this one, to me, spoke to a real intuitive insight that how you perform, and this has implications for growth, actually, for economic growth and development effectiveness, how you perform is very often reflective of how you are expected to perform, how you are recognized, how your talents are recognized. I was at the World Social Forum in India, and a little Muslim child came on the platform, and he said that he had dropped out of school. And he dropped out of school because his teacher said, "Oh, you're a Muslim child, you're just going to grow up to be a terrorist." And I thought to myself, is there any better guarantee of turning this child into a terrorist than calling him at that age? So these prejudices, preconceptions, stereotypes are a very powerful way of both blocking escape from poverty and increasing the likelihood of the noisy consequences of poverty. So what I think is the task of social scientists is not simply to understand the phenomenon, but also to think about how to change it. And I can only end here with some very general points. But I think those points relate to, if you like, the specificity of intersecting inequalities. In particular, the specificities that are presented, that present a challenge to what we do, and that is questions of recognition, cultural valuation, and identity. And so I would like to end with just a few basic lessons, which to some extent echo what we've heard. And that is, first of all, I think that the state remains fundamental. Not because the state is wonderful, we've heard about corrupt states, ineffective states, but really because in principle, the state is the only institution in society which has a mandate to respond to the interests of all its citizens. That is not true of families, That is not true of civil society, and it's certainly not true of markets. So I think effective states, building up state capacity, democratizing states, is a very important part of the pathway to change. But of course, there is this chicken and egg problem. How do you turn a state that is unfair, unresponsive into a slightly better one? And there I think it is the question of active civil society. And the question then is, I think, for organizations like Sida and for development partnerships, is where is it most effective to intervene? Are the relationships with the state sufficiently cooperative that one can start the discussions around, learning from each other? Or is it better to support civil society organizations? Of course, very often the states that are not responsive are also not very responsive to allowing you access to building civil society. But given that we have an international and interconnected world, the ability of states to block solidarity movements is far more restricted than it used to be. Macroeconomic policies, we've seen in the report, we've talked about taxation, we've talked about, I don't know if we have, but we should talk a bit more about employment-centered growth, because all of these things create the enabling environment where there is enough of the resources that people value to go around. But we also know that simply allowing macroeconomic policies to be enabling will not necessarily reach down to the very poorest. And there I think questions around social protection and social provision become important. And I think here we should recognize a tension between the universal and the targeted. I don't think universal needs to mean uniform. I think universal services may often require targeting. The targeting does not have to be naming people's identities. It can be, in a way, not talking about them, but it can be about underserved populations, underserved areas. In India, I go back to India because I do research on that, there is a very strong correlation between the percentage of a district's population that is Muslim or lower caste and the amount of health services and doctors they have. So the higher the percentage of Muslims in lower caste, the fewer the doctors and health services. So one could easily have targeting around geography, targeting around underserved populations and so on. But I think some degree of targeting may be important in order to ensure that those basic services reach all. The other important factor, I think, in intersecting inequalities is the mindset. There are, in addition to these vertical inequalities, the inequalities that we as citizens hold against each other. We as citizens reproduce because of the stereotypes and the preconceptions that we hold in our own minds about others. When in Britain we saw the UKIP party with its poster of billions of refugees trying to stream into Britain and the slogan "Breaking Point," how did that feed in to the rise in hate crimes that has taken place in Britain after the Brexit vote? How did we manage to single out certain sections of our population as somehow bringing the country to a breaking point? So I think this area of culture and discourse, these kind of things that don't operate, that don't feature that much in economic theory, though I think economics is making more room for it, these are extremely important. I think the social media, I think television. Very interestingly, in Bangladesh, we found that routine access to television actually had a very empowering effect on the population. We were very puzzled by this because we see a lot of the television and most of it is crap. It's Bollywood soaps. But, in Bangladesh, as argumentative Bengalis, a lot of television is about political talk shows. And for some reason, the country is mesmerized by political talk shows. And they learn a lot from these political talk shows. So I think in finding ways of making the media accessible, interesting, provocative, dynamic, and challenging mindsets is a very powerful path to addressing the identity-based aspects of inequalities. A couple of final points. If you are dealing with group-based inequalities, the answer cannot lie in individualized solutions. You cannot say, I am going to give you microfinance and let's hope for the best. Because our microfinance is going to hit all the barriers that have kept you poor so far. The barriers that don't allow you to take up certain occupations, that don't allow you to go to certain schools, that don't allow you to send your children to certain schools. So I think group-based inequalities require group-based solutions, and that means building the collective capabilities of marginalized groups to articulate their own interests and to be able to hold a more decentralized state to account. I think it is also important that ameliorative approaches are not going to do it. This is hardcore inequality. This is inequality that has lasted over generations. And we need more than amelioration. We need transformation. And transformation means addressing inequalities simultaneously on several fronts. So, for instance, if we're talking about providing schooling, and providing schooling in an inclusive way, that must include the language in which schooling is provided, the content of the schooling that we provide, the attitudes of the teachers, the availability of toilets for girls, the accessibility to schools. So we cannot just say we're going to build more schools and get more teachers. To address intersecting inequalities, we need coordinated approaches that act on the physical, material, cultural, and political fronts. And finally, of course, and it's the word we heard earlier about interdependence. I think one of the things that climate change has done, it has brought home to us in a way more urgently than before, the costs of not acknowledging interdependence. We live in a world where what you eat and the clothes you wear and the car you drive has repercussions for the future of the planet. And what you're doing in New York is going to affect what people are doing. In Bangladesh, we look like we're going to be drowning in a few 50, 60 years. And it wasn't really our fault. It was the fault of the overconsumption and the indifference to the environment that has characterized industrialization in the north and continues to characterize industrialization in the south. But interdependence is also about what happens when you wage war, a war that is not seen as justified in one part of the world, and then wonder why there are streams of refugees invading your part of the world. I mean, I am as troubled as anyone else on a very self-interested basis because of these terrorist attacks that are happening in Paris, in London, in New York, and everywhere else. But every day I remind myself that the number of civilians that die in these attacks must be also balanced against the number of civilians that are dying today and have died in the past decades with the bombings and the drones and all the new weaponry. So I think interdependence today is not just about the planet, but it is importantly about the planet. It is also about how injustice in one place is going to be about injustice everywhere. And I think that is the challenge we are now facing. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank the speakers for a series of wonderful, extremely interesting talks, short introduction into the report topics. I think it really helped us highlight the amazing contributions that there are in this report, but also how timely, relevant, important tackling this topic is. So I was, we've worked together in the past 2 years, but it was fantastic listening to you again. So I'm inviting everyone here to go and read the contributions that are in the report. So start thinking about questions that you want to ask to our panelists. I would like perhaps to just start and kick off this discussion. Would like to do that rather informally. So whenever you feel ready, just raise your hand and we'll make sure to allow you to speak. But I'd like to go back perhaps to the way we started this conversation and this session by highlighting some of the goals, purposes of a report like this. So we talked about identifying how the many intersecting dimensions form configurations of inequalities that change from countries to countries and impact the societies there. We've talked about consequences, we've talked about solutions. And I think that in the three interventions, you made the interactions and the intersecting aspect extremely explicit, and it was in the three presentations. I think, Naila, you just again really reminded us of the importance of that, and I think the consequences as well, the potential dramatic consequences of the current trends came out rather strongly in the three presentations. But I'd like to take you back to the question of solutions, and perhaps push you a little bit here and ask you to be a bit more explicit about solutions, possible solutions. During your presentation, Melissa, you said solutions will have to combine the relationship between the local and the global. They will have to take that into account. Bo, during your presentation, you really articulated the fact that corruption actually takes place at a rather local level. Naila, you were going up to the national level, but as you rightly said, we know this is a global world. So I'd like to hear you on the articulation of these various levels and the quest for solutions. So that would be a first question. So perhaps, Melissa, if you want to share some thoughts on that first question.
Okay. Is this working? Yeah. Well, thank you, Mathieu. This is absolutely what we try to look at in the report, and the part that talks about building pathways to a more just world very explicitly looks at and argues for a relationship between the things that need to come from the top down, as it were. And here I very much echo Naila's emphasis on the role of the state. We need good, trustworthy states and state action and forms of regulation and universal social policies with effective forms of targeting. But we also show very much that whether you get that kind of state and whether states act in the ways that we might like to see them act towards reducing inequality also depends on pressure from below. And that can be the pressure that comes through electoral representative democracy. And yes, it's true that the countries that have done well at certain periods in reducing inequalities have tended to have left-leaning governments. But it's not only the case. We've also seen examples where you get political pressure coming through protests, through slightly more unruly forms, as well as through more organized civil society, pushing for certain kinds of policy change to happen. And I think it's that combination of active progressive states and the civil society pressure that can encourage them to do certain things that we really need. Connecting up then with the global, the report has quite a lot in it about the roles of global governance. Adebayo Olukoshi talks about this very eloquently in relation to the roles of a reformed UN system and its responsibilities, particularly in relation to Africa. We also have a piece by my IDS colleague Mick Moore, which looks at taxation as a really key strategy for reducing inequalities in countries, but also the fact that taxation is also an interconnected question. And if you have, for instance, good taxation on corporations in one country, there's a real risk of a kind of tragedy of the commons problem, and companies will simply move to low tax zones. So big moves towards international transparency in countries and businesses having to declare and be transparent about declaring tax rates, which can move, I think, towards some of these forms of recognition of the interdependence internationally that needs to coincide with these national forms.
Let me take up the global aspect of it. I think there are a number of ways, I think, that the global-local interact and can interact very positively. And interestingly, I think one of the ways is by opening up free flow of ideas and information and models of living to different parts of the world. Where I think television has been so powerful is that it actually takes people who may not move out of their own homes and villages and opens them up to the fact that things that they take for granted in their part of the world, forms of patriarchy, next door may not look at all natural. So I think one of the things that why I talk about the media is, though I'm a very strong materialist, I think for material change to happen, it has to be driven by changing ideas and changing aspirations and changing models. So one is kind of battles on the cultural front in which the global and the local ought to be interacting. But the second, I think, is around, one of the problems, I think, of international aid has been that it has often come with ideologies that are not necessarily responsive to local realities. So I am all for what I regarded as the universals, the rule of law, the right to participate, all of those things are there. But if they come in language that is not necessarily speaking to local realities, I think they are seen as somehow alien. So I remember I was at Lund not long ago, and I was asked to speak about this idea of, you might be interested, of a feminist foreign policy. Okay, and what do we mean by a feminist foreign policy for Sweden? And my argument was that feminism evokes reactions. I am a feminist, and I often disguise it as a way of getting an audience. If you stand up in certain places and declare yourself a feminist, you can see half of the audience are switched off because they think they know what you're going to say. Calling something a feminist foreign policy, I think, will get that reaction. Calling it an ethical foreign policy, on the other hand, has greater buy-in because it doesn't come, if you like, that's my view, that it doesn't come as loaded with certain kind of Western ideology. So I think the global-local is about a conversation that takes place where we learn from each other and struggle to find out what we have in common. And I think my final point, of course, is that none of these changes are going to happen without resources. And we do know, I find it extraordinary that the British government, through all its changes of government, has stuck to the 0.7% aid figure. But we also know that a lot of countries haven't. And I think if we're going to talk about social services, we're going to talk about all of this, some of it has to come from local resources, from tax, etc. But some of it has to be done in partnership with our global partners.
As soon as you mention corruption, this is the issue that comes up, how to fix it. And I say to people, this is the hardest question I've ever come across. Just to give you a feeling for how hard it is, some 15, 20 years ago, many international development organizations, the World Bank, also the Swedish international development organizations, actually listened to social science and started to take corruption and low quality of government issues seriously and launched, especially the World Bank, avalanche of programs. They don't like to use the word corruption, so they use a type of newspeak, good governance, but it's basically the same. However, the evaluations that have been coming in the last 4 or 5 years, and my institute in Gothenburg, or former institute, have been part of that, shows a very depressing result. You cannot today point at one developing country that have improved, as it can be measured, their quality of government because of any international aid program. There are countries, quite a lot of, that have improved. Some have gotten worse, but some have improved. But nothing of this comes from international aid. So we're speaking about a zero result. That is the starting point. A little more than half a year ago, I and youngish colleagues produced a policy report for the Swedish government's expert group on aid analysis, where we try to get at this problem, starting with this gigantic, massive policy failure. The report is titled Making Development Work, the Quality of Government Approach. It points at that most anti-corruption policies have been based on a theory that in all likelihood represents a very serious misspecification of the problem. This theory is known as the principal agent theory. We have suggested, and this becomes a little technical, that instead one should think of the problem as a collective action problem, and that calls for very, very different policy prescriptions. Based on the empirical work I and my colleagues have been doing in Gothenburg, we come out with 5 policy prescriptions. Now, policy prescription in this area are quite difficult because they're either too structural. So you point at long historical traits or having been a Lutheran country or things like that. That is all fine and correct, but it's like little like going, if you have cancer and you're terrified, you run to your doctor and you ask, what should I do, what should I do? And the doctor says, I know exactly, you should have had other parents. It's a scientifically correct answer, but from a policy perspective, it's of course useless, right? And then we have all the, what we call, with not so nice terminology, the trivialists. So they say, oh, you have to have, you know, an honest civil service and independent courts and the rule of law and ethical codes. That is also correct, but basically that is just like saying, in order not to have the place problem, don't have it in the first place. There is no distance between the independent and the dependent variable. It's just a repetition of the data. So we point at 5. One is meritocracy. From Mick Moore and others, and also from the taxation system, of course, a fair. If you don't pay taxes, you don't care about the quality of the services. We point at, we have quite good at a functioning national audit system. We point at universal education, very important. And this is quite surprising, but very clear. Gender equality. I don't know what feminism is because there are so many different sorts. So I don't go into that debate. But gender equality, measured as the number of women in representative parliamentary assemblies, who has a clear effect. To my surprise, many of my feminist colleagues get quite nervous with this result because they smell essentialism, and they are not really fond of essentialism. That is also a debate I, as a simple political scientist, don't go into. But one reflection I've done is that, think of criminal behavior. If you go into any prison system in the world, you will find that 96% of the inmates for serious crime are men. Now, corruption is basically an illegal practice. Why shouldn't we see the same there? If this is nature or nurture, it's not for me to say. But it's very, very clear that you get an effect. These are my colleagues, Lena Wegner and Marsha Grimes. We had a large conference in May on gender equality. And all these are, of course, actionable. I'm not saying any of this is easy, but we can actually show that if countries that have gone in these 5 directions, they have a much better track record than other ones. Sorry, but a complicated question.
Thank you very much. I will open the floor now for a question. If I can just get a sense of how many questions we have. And I would, of course, also allow, our speakers to raise questions to your colleagues if you want to. If you allow me, we'll take 2 questions.
Could I just come back on that one?
Yeah, please do that. We'll start with that.
No, I think it's not just essentialism. Oh, sorry. Yes, I think the fear is essentialism. I think what I also sense, and I agree with you, but what I also sense is this argument about instrumentalism. That a lot of feminists are very afraid that you will start arguing for greater equality in parliament because it will lead to less corruption rather than because it is a principle of justice. However, my attitude is, if the data tell me this, then unless someone finds me contrary evidence, then I'm quite happy to say that actually more women in parliament will lead to less corruption.
Okay. Thank you.
My track on this is going to the Swedish law about medical practice. According to this law, if you're a doctor, you're allowed to prescribe a drug or a treatment based on two things. One is scientific evidence, so you actually know how the causality works. In this case, we don't. But there is another ground. You can also prescribe it based on known experience. You don't know why people get well, but they do get well. And that is my simple tack on this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have one question here, please.
Hi, Wendy Broadgate, Future Earth. Thanks for this rich analysis. I mean, this report is full of so many factors of that and solutions, potential solutions. We are moving away from the goal globally and in many countries around the world. If you were to select a single priority area to start to tip the transformation in the right direction, what solutions area would you invest in?
Thank you. And the question, just colleague behind you.
Yeah, I'm Zainab Tagildin, researcher at KTH and SLU. I'm not social scientist, I'm a planner. So I will quote here Friedman, who said, like, planning is the art of taking knowledge into practice. From that, what I learned as planner, I learned that social science theory has influenced a lot the development of planning thinking. So I was a little bit here, the knowledge of social science, when it's produced, I mean, there was a chart here in one of the presentation showed that the amount of knowledge produced in the Western context usually has been dominated historically as well. So what we learned that, for instance, as planning theory has been so much inspired by the social science theory and the evolution of social science theory from the rational planning to communicative planning based on thinkers like Habermas, Foucault, etc. So my thought here, it's always possible to produce reports about social science issues and about different case studies. But if we want to institutionalize this knowledge and take into consideration the epistemology of the knowledge production from the South perspective, what could be this kind of reports help us? Because you talk, one of the aspects you mentioned maybe, and also you focus, both of you or three of you, about the knowledge divides and the knowledge as one of the main aim. But how we can institutionalize that, not just talk about them as fragmented issues, inequalities in terms of economic and in terms of gender, etc. But how we can make it institutionalized more from using the Southern lenses into the knowledge production and then make it more built up, not just temporary and responding to certain specific items or priority. Because it's always, we have a trend and we have new fashions that came through years. We start by economy that drive this process, and then political issues like governance terms and all those terms that always appear and attract our interest. And yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very good question. We'll take one third question here to a colleague in the front.
Yes. Yes, it's Sida taking the opportunity. Thank you very much. I think this is exactly what we need. We need a discussion where we are reflecting on how your work can inform policy making, and we are dependent on Swedish politicians taking the right decisions for guiding us for what to do. So, and this happens to seldom that we really discuss this together. And I think it would be interesting to hear what would have happened. I mean, when you were looking into this, did the World Bank, for instance, do anything about good governance? Perhaps they didn't, but did they invest in gender equality and education? I think what I see a lot of now is that when we are here in Sweden, a lot of politicians is in New York, and they are pledging in silos different objectives from the global goals on stage, not necessarily informed by this kind of debate. But our work is to work for them and to help them not to fall into that trap necessarily. And I think this is so important because we might win an opportunity now around the SDGs, or we will just continue to work in 17 silos. And I just want you maybe to be a bit louder in your reach out with this kind of information, and look for the right partners to make conferences like this really targeting the audience that needs to listen to you. And it's states, yes, but it's also private sector, because states are talking to capital. And I just think about that. How can we be helpful? Because I'm on Twitter, and I just got somebody arguing with me when I quoted Bo and said, yes, Charlotte, you should know that aid is the problem. And I'm arguing it's not, because we can invest in knowledge, we can invest in root causes, we can, based on a good analysis, we can be part of the solution. But on a bad analysis, we will be part of the problem. So I guess it's more a plea than a question, and I should end now. But
thank you very much for reminding us of the importance of working across scales with different actors. We don't have much time. We have 3 extremely challenging questions, so I'll ask you to, in the order that you want, try and address them the best you can.
Okay, great questions, and I'm actually going to address them in a way that connects them up, because first answer to Wendy is there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and it's not technical, it's political. But if I had to argue for one priority, it would be to connect up and learn from the multitude of alternative futures that are being built through small seeds in different parts of the world, often in invisible ways, often in small community groups, or in the solidarity economies of towns and cities in parts of Asia and Africa, or in the experimental movements that are actually responding to intersecting multiple inequalities in different places. And I think these offer us really important seeds of transformation, partly because they are addressing, as people live them, multiple intersecting inequalities, partly because, although they're small at the moment, they have the potential, through learning, through media, through social media, to connect up and begin to be the motorways that actually take these small footprints and become the highways and the motorways that can begin to displace dominant ways of thinking as well as acting. So my priority would be to learn from all of those things and bring them to visibility and to light. So this then is a response to the second question about how do we institutionalize some of the things we've been talked about. I think the most urgent task is to have institutionalized funding support for this kind of knowledge, actually. At the moment, it's very invisible. It's often not even formalized by what social scientists are doing, certainly not what they're publishing, as our bibliometrics show. But to begin to create citizen science, social science networks which can interrogate and research the realities of living intersecting inequalities and the solutions which we're already forming through new networks, which are going to need to be supported by enlightened funders and by those with the capacity to create networks amongst them, can, I think, take us a long way forward. And this would again then be a response to the point about silos. I've been going around the world many people are not fans of the SDG agenda because they say it's too complicated. 17 goals, all donors can do is pick on a few. And I think that's a disaster. What we've got here is a really important, transformative agenda for people and planet. But that's going to require joined up governance, joined up business action, joined up citizen action, and the joined up knowledge which can interact with and support those things. So I'm shouting loudly in many quarters, often with my Future Earth and Environment hat on as well, certainly with my IDS hat on, and I think this report is a really strong further piece of justification for why governments, businesses, citizens, and global institutions need to get out of their siloed boxes and realize that the ways people are living are not parceled up into silos. And if we want to tackle inequalities and leave no one behind, we've got to start from where people are at.
Naila, perhaps a few last challenging thoughts.
I'll just make a couple of points, which kind of, again, touch on these. One is, I think, for the last 30 years, we have been dominated by an ideology of individualism and individual gain and market-based citizenship. And that has left no vision for social justice for those who are not going to benefit through the market, because the market is loaded against them. We've never said the market is fair. The market can be regulated to be fair, but it is not left to its own devices very fair. So I see it in my own country, in Bangladesh. The language of microfinance is now the dominant language for poor people to get out of poverty. But it offers nothing more than integration into the market economy. The old organizations that talked about social justice and citizenship rights and participation, those have been wiped out by this move towards markets-based financial sustainability. So one priority is, I think, let us take advantage of the fact that so many different dominant organizations are now talking about inequality and that are now questioning the wisdom of the neoliberal, unfettered neoliberal approach. And let us try and build an alliance around that so that the voices are amplified. I hear people like Stiglitz, like Milanovic, like all the people, Atkinson, that you've quoted, and then I hear people in different parts of the world. How do we bring that together in a coalition for justice, which takes economic inequality as its core, because it remains core to everyone, but acknowledges all these other forms of inequality. So for me, one is about this coordinated action around inequality in order to build a vision of justice. I think the second is a point that you touched on, and that is at the ground level about human capabilities. We take education, and it has become, education is so powerful. It has all my research and all the research around us tells us, and this is lousy education, right? This is really bad education, poor quality education. If we could deliver decent education, think of the transformation that would bring about. But with education, of course, health and all those other things that are important. But when we talk about north-south divides in knowledge, knowledge has become colonized by the aid industry. All the reports that come out in many countries are now consultancy reports. They are servicing the aid industry. That old-fashioned knowledge, which is by Southern scholars in Southern universities, has disappeared. People don't earn enough money as university lecturers to survive. And so one of the things I feel so sorry about is that deep, one of the things that amazes me about the Nordic countries is you have statistics on everything. Like every bit of daily life, you've got statistics. So every citizen knows about their country. There are vast tracts of our countries we know nothing about. Maternal mortality, we have statistics, but we actually don't know why it is so hard to shake. So I would like to see knowledge driven by for knowledge's sake. And here I think there's a slight dichotomy between ivory tower academia and consultancy-driven knowledge. There has to be a happy medium where we engage in research which is about solving the problems of the real world without quick fixes and technical solutions. And that requires a kind of investment, I think. So I think for me, those are very important priorities. And the private sector. I wish someone would tell me how we get... There are sections of the private sector we know that believe in their responsibilities as corporate citizens. But we also know so much of it is hypocrisy, In Bangladesh at the moment, post-Rana Plaza, there is a battle being played out as to what exactly these new agreements, are they for public consumption? Are the buyers genuinely committed? Are the employers genuine? This is the private sector, and I have to say, I despair.
So we will in a second be able to continue the conversation over food. Perhaps the last remarks to you, Bo.
On the first issue, if I had one choice, I would go for reasonably high quality universal education starting very low, preschools and up. And the arguments are, of course, from neuroscience. This is very important. But I would also like to underline, if you get the kids to school, you could do a lot of things with them. You can feed them, you immunize them, give them clothing, and so on. And we find very strong historical correlations. Mean years of schooling we have for 78 countries in 1870, and it correlates on a 0.7 level with today's levels of corruption. Italy is a miracle. Italy gets such a reform in 1859. It's implemented to the letter in the northern region, nothing in the south. And you saw what I showed. We can still see the effect today. So if I would have one choice about academia, I'm not a political activist, I'm a social scientist, but I think I've written some 400 op-ed articles over the years, about 40 about this issue. On Wednesday next week, I will go to DFID in London and talk. The week after to the World Economic Forum, who are actually now taking the connection between business and corruption seriously. So I do this a lot of time. But there is, of course, one problem when you say, do the politicians listen to us? This sector has, I think, over the years been dominated by three theories that have been very dysfunctional. One is the post-colonial theory, the other one is the dependency theory, and the third one is this principal agent theory. So the problem we have is that when we now come and say, now you should think differently, many politicians say, why should we listen to you? We listened to your colleagues before, and everything went astray. So I'm not that extremely optimistic that they will listen, because they have listened before, and many things they heard were not good enough. We stayed out of the policy community for 8 years until we thought we actually had something empirically and theoretically grounded. But too many people have jumped just from theory. Sorry to say, many of my friends in economics and development policy right to policy issues without thinking about, is it actually this way the system works? I mean, the principal agent theory says you have to have an honest principle to change the incentives for the dishonest agents. Well, I have two comments. One is, if corruption and bad quality of government was an issue about incentives, we would have fixed it long ago. It would have been a piece of cake, right? And honestly, in a systemically corrupt setting, where should you find the honest principle? Who should it be? Jacob Mugabe? Jacob Zuma, Robert Mugabe, Gaddafi. I mean, who should this person be? It's a ghost. The theory is built on a ghost. And it's actually, I think, intellectually unhealthy to work with a theory that depends on an agent that is not supposed to exist, according to the theory. So I'm a little, when you listen to what I had to say, I didn't mention democracy. And democracy is a little problematic here, because in newly democratized states, the temptation for the winning political party or coalition to use the state in a clientelistic way to reward its followers seem to become overwhelming. If there is a government change tomorrow in Mexico, 70,000 civil servants leave. In Denmark, it's 26. That's the spectrum you have.
Thank you very much. I'll leave you, Magnus, close the session. But once again, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the International Social Science Council, thank you very much for being here with us today. And I hope we'll continue these exchanges on the report and other important societal challenges in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank all the speakers and participants and for indulging this. We spent more time than we thought we would, but we have been privileged to have these interesting and important discussions. And that is why we're here. So there will be time to eat something outside for those who wish. And I just want to thank the collaborators here, my staff, Kim and Britta, and the great collaboration that we've had with ISSC and the support from Sida and everybody who has been helping to make this report reality. There are a few copies of the full report out there, so if you're quick and eager, maybe you could grab one. And there are plenty of these fantastic summaries, so you can all get that. And I remind you that the report, the summary and the full report, and all of this, the film from the sessions, are available through our web pages there from the ISSC and SSEESS. So, thank you all, and thank you to the technicians.